and welcome back to the Legal Weekly Wine, where we discuss the week's hottest legal topics. Up today, the transgender care case that is currently being considered by the United States Supreme Court. We are going to discuss the ins and outs of it, the factual background, what the Supreme Court's response has been during the hearing, during the arguments, and overall what we think may happen based on constitutional law and precedent in the United States. So that's our topic today. We've got U.S. versus Skrmetti. I'm Virginia Tehrani. I'm the CEO of The Law Unscripted, which hosts this podcast of the Legal Weekly Wine. We also provide bar review and law school review courses for the 8 core subjects. Law students, get them today. I know you've got law exams coming up this month if you're not already in the midst of it. If you want to test your skills with some hypotheticals before you take them on the test, we've got those too. Go to thelawunscripted.com to find those. You can also find our law firm, Tehrani Law LLC, because you never need a lawyer till you do. That's also online at TehraniLaw.com. We practice primarily in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. I'm the owner and attorney practicing in there, and we have our second attorney, Chelsey Rogers, on with us today, who's also involved in The Law Unscripted. Welcome, Chelsey.
Hi, glad to be here.
Glad to have you here. You make life interesting, and a lot of people, I think, watch this show because of you, which I can't blame them. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm not the eye candy.
Neither of us is. Dr.
Yeah,
Vile,
I'm actually the constitutional law expert, obviously. Everybody who's watched the show knows that.
I mean, honestly, look at her. She's a drop-dead, gorgeous blonde with beautiful appearance, fun and funny and witty. Makes the funniest comments of all of us. So she's got the drop in the levity here. But Dr. Vile, you bring the class. This is Dr.
Absolutely.
John Vile. He is the Dean of the Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, and he is our expert in constitutional law, the Constitution, and the amending process. He's a political scientist, and we are pleased to have you, Dr. Vile.
Good to be here.
And we are going to be relying, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Vile's memory is a vault. I can research something and I can remember it for a day or two. I'm really great at arguing an issue. But after I'm done, I have another case. I have another client. I have another Weekly Wine podcast. So I move on and there's like, wait, did we talk about that? What was that? But Dr. Vile's memory, I tell you, when you go, the world will have lost a truly great mind.
I'm leaving my books behind.
Yeah, great. So everybody go out and yeah, you have many to choose among for your weekly reading. But Dr. Vile, truly, I'm glad you're on here, especially today, because you have more of the background and memory on the prior cases that could give us some insight as to what the Supreme Court is reviewing, what their decisions might be and why, because this is an extremely personal issue to a lot of people. It's not just a legal issue, it's a personal issue. And yeah, let's take a drink to that. Our Legal Weekly Wine, back with some Pepsi. Chelsey, have you got another Aldi special?
I do. I have my Aldi Sprite over here, but I might dip into the wine in a little bit. We'll see how this conversation goes, because this one is fascinating to me. I listened to the oral arguments about this case, and so I'm invested.
Amazing. And that's great. So I'm glad we've got some extra. I've got more personal ideas on this one, so I'm going to let you two take a lot of the lead on the legal and the arguments, but I am bringing back the Sonoma Coast Chardonnay, La Crema, from our friend Nicole Hagedorn and her daughter Margaret Lawson. Margaret, who's my goddaughter, as well as our intern. They gifted it over the holidays for Thanksgiving, so thank you very much for providing us some wine for our weekly wine. Cheers, and here we go. The long pause. I tried to do the gulp for you, Chelsey.
I was going to say that's what's missing is my long gulps that we used to get when we were in person.
Yeah, but the other week when you were up here in person and we got to actually clink glasses and hear your gulp, it just warmed my heart. those of you who can't see, our eye candy is bursting out laughing completely.
Sorry. Yeah. I was laughing so hard. I muted myself on accident when I went forward. So.
All right. So, Dr. Vile, we have U.S. versus Skrmetti that was heard in oral arguments on December 4th. Tell us what the actual factual background of this case is and why it's before the Supreme Court.
So, Tennessee has joined a number of other states in basically outlawing what is known as gender-affirming care. And my understanding is that can refer either to puberty blockers, which are like drugs that one would take to delay the onset of puberty.
Hormones.
Secondary sexual characteristics. And it would also bar, as I understand it, any surgery, removal of breasts, for example, from someone who's born female and identifies as male, or the like. And the primary issue before the court, as I understand it, was an issue of equal protection. It's a classification that seems to be based, I guess you would say, on sex. Basically, Tennessee is saying that the sex that you were anatomically born with is the sex that you have to maintain at least through childhood. And I believe it's 18, but it might be 16. I think some of the state laws vary in terms of, when this care is forbidden. But basically for minors, the state of Tennessee has said we're not permitting that. It would be a crime to give puberty blockers or to perform operations on children to change the identity that they were born, their sexual identity that they were born with. And so the question is, and actually it's interesting, the newest, Justice Jackson, the newest appointee to the Supreme Court, brought in the case of Loving versus Virginia, I believe it is, in which there was a state law in Virginia which said whites can't marry blacks and blacks can't marry white.
Right, the interracial marriage issue.
And the state said it's not discrimination because it applies equally to blacks as it applies equally to whites as it does to blacks. And the Supreme Court basically said, no, you're making a judgment here that violates equal protection. And to some degree, the cases involving gay marriage, Obergefell and some of the others probably would also come into play here. What I would like to at least mention is maybe ultimately this isn't so much a constitutional case as it is a case of who decides. And states do regulate medical procedures, right? So if a state were to say, we oppose bleeding of patients who have high temperatures,
right,
we would probably consider that a legitimate rule, right? Bleeding. Yeah. Apparently there are some cases where it can be used, but not in the way that it was traditionally used. So they're saying we're in charge of public health. On the other hand, what they're also saying is that they are a better judge of the evidence than doctors, parents, and children.
Yes.
And traditionally, and here this is sort of a cross-cutting issue, because conservatives typically are the people who say, parents ought to have the right to send their children to parochial schools.
Yeah.
Should have
parents
the choice of what they learn.
Right. Parents ought to be informed if there's birth control or if there's...
They were the ones freaking out about kids getting COVID shots, if I remember,
that's
a couple years ago.
There were some of them that were objecting to that. And I must say that there was one of the other things that's really peculiar about this case in the arguments is for 20 years now, justices on the court have been arguing about the degree to which American law should be predicated on laws in Europe.
Yes.
And
Oh,
usually
interesting.
the conservatives have said, forget it. We have our own constitution. It should be paramount over what the European Union does.
Right.
But in this case, primarily it was those arguing to uphold the Tennessee law who said in Europe they were all on board with this, and now they're beginning to have reservations, and they are themselves putting limits on care for minors.
Chelsey, you're chomping at the bit here.
There's so much here. And I think it's interesting. One, I think the arguments were very, very interesting. And this was honestly strange, at least in my opinion, for the first kind of half of the arguments. It seemed like everybody kind of got lost on the topic. Like it was basically questions about transgender anything. And I don't know why that happened, but it did seem like some of the back and forth kind of, I don't know what happened. And then it was like they got like midpoint, they kind of got back on track to like what we're actually discussing. I think it's interesting because they're making the argument that this is discrimination on the basis of sex, saying that you could have two children. One has precocious puberty and one is trying to transition. And so the treatment theoretically would be the same, right? But if one is a boy and one is a girl, they would allow one and would not allow the other, which I think is an interesting legal argument. I think that was an interesting argument. And then I did sort of like, again, it was fascinating to listen to. Tennessee came back and was like, oh no, we are discriminating, just not on the basis of sex. It's about age, and that's not a protected class, which I thought fair response. So I think that was interesting.
Yeah,
much of the argument, by the way, it centers on something which is very arcane, which is which of three levels of scrutiny are we going to get this law?
Strict
it's not
scrutiny.
A suspect category, but if it's sex, it's intermediate.
Yes, exactly.
Which is more than you would give ordinary economic legislation. And I think for a non-lawyer listening to this, it's like, what is, why don't they get to the point? And frankly, I don't think that parental rights actually got mentioned very much.
Which seems to me to be the key. Is if they're minors, we've got the guardianship issues, right? Because minors, we've got the guardianship when they're in school for minors and what rights, if any, they have through school. We've got even questioning of minors in criminal cases, they have to have their parents.
Yes.
Right? So to me, Chelsey, I'm with you, is honestly the age piece is more a question for me, is it's less surrounding sex than an age issue. Because
that's what I said. And I was shocked because we have cases that have been up at the Supreme Court about minors seeking medical care that their parents might disagree with or agree with. And we have precedent about that very specific topic. And so I was very confused why that was not really the focus. I think it would be more comparable to the cases where 14, 15-year-old girl is seeking birth control or an abortion. Would be more relevant. But you're right. It didn't really come up. It didn't really seem to be the focus.
Yeah. And that's the other thing is, right, we've got some even religious sects that don't want medical care for their children, right? And they want to be able to decide, does my child, no blood transfusions.
Right. They can choose to let their child die versus get a blood transfusion. That's their right.
In most cases, they cannot, I believe, unless you know it better than I do.
There was a huge one. It was either in Minnesota or Michigan. I'm mixing them up. Last year that went up to their Supreme Court, and I cannot remember which state it is. One of the M states, but yes. And it was about them choosing to not heed medical advice, and their devoutly held religious views were against blood transfusions, and that they were permitted to do that. Religious freedom, which I think personally, I think is crazy. I think that's nuts.
My reading, which could be mistaken, is that the court takes sort of a case-by-case approach to this, but more often than not, if they think it is life-threatening, they tend to override the parents on behalf of the child.
But with that argument, if this sexual piece of it is not life-threatening, then the law seems to withhold or support a parental decision. Yes. So in my idea, it's more of a parental decision than it is a state decision or even an issue of sex or race, etc. And this is hard for me because I have so many friends that are LGBTQ. I have such a support of them and want to make sure that they do have all of their rights protected and do have the ability to make the decisions. For me, though, legally, it just still goes back to, like you're saying, an age issue, less a sex issue, more of an age issue. Because look, I mean, of all of the state and federal things that we don't allow for children or require, at least depending on what it is, like marriage, right? Some parents can give consent for minors to be married. At least in some states, it's like age 16, as long as they have parental consent.
Now, for me, it would be 30. I think parents ought to have that right at least till
up until 30.
That's right.
A parental veto for, marriage up until 30. I like it.
Yeah, but technically right now, I think it's 16 if they want to. But
Same with drinking in some states. There are some states that allow, even at restaurants, that if you are with your guardian and you're under the age of 21, that you can still drink if your guardian approves it.
Exactly. So it goes to me to parental rights, parental choices. They can choose for children not to be vaccinated. They can make other medical decisions. So this goes also to the medical issue. They can make medical decisions. We've got smoking.
They can make schooling decisions. They can choose to unschool their kids where they just don't really do anything and they've taken them out of school. They can homeschool them. All of these parental decisions, I don't see how this is different.
Yeah. I mean, we've got, and then federal decisions, smoking isn't allowed until 18. Drinking isn't allowed technically until 21. The medical issues, voting, you can't vote until you're 18. Tattoos, we've got those similar issues as there's an age limit versus parental consent. Abortion, birth control, all of these get into age and parental consent. That's what we're looking at. So I agree. If we were looking at adults, then I am absolutely on board with equal protection. If they choose it, they should get it. If that's what they want, that's their decision. They're adults. They should choose it. They should get their option. Maybe we shouldn't fund it through insurance, but it's their choice. But then we get into all of the background, the legal background, the constitutional background, these case precedents as to what minors can do and what parents have control over versus the other. Dr. Weil, what's your thought on those?
Well, actually, I was talking with a colleague about, how I was surprised more parental rights didn't come up. And she said, well, good luck finding that in the Constitution. And in a sense, she's right. I mean, we do have cases, particularly dealing with homeschooling and the like,
right,
that have recognized it. But it's harder to point to a specific provision of the Constitution for parental rights than it is for some of the others. So that may have influenced in part what happened.
But we do have, I mean, even with that, we've got how many parental decisions that have been recognized either by state or federal law or constitutional law cases that are saying it. So to me,
I mean, one way of phrasing it is, who is more likely to have the best interests of the child in mind?
Right. Is it the state or the
legislator, or is it a parent? And there are cases where, parents might not make the right choice or might not be educated enough, but you would think generally they would have the greatest incentive. They would be hopefully in closest communication with the child and know their needs better than someone who's trying to make a political point. And I'm not disparaging. I mean, I think many of the people who have adopt these laws do it. They have very, they tend to see sort of black and white. You're either male or female. There are two choices. God made you one way. You're stuck. That's what you are. And I don't think they're at all insincere. But are they? If I had to make a decision for a child, I think I'd rather make it than have the state legislature tell me what the decision should be.
Exactly. And like you said, not all parents are right, and maybe they make the wrong decision, but would we rather the parent, if we're going to regulate it at all, would we rather give it to the parent to help decide versus the state?
Right. I think it's a thing that you have a child, a parent, and someone who's willing to do it, a doctor, a surgeon, depending on whatever the case is. Like, I think that they probably have a better idea. One, I think this is like one of those things that what percentage of people, I think if we pulled the numbers of like what this is actually impacting, this is a very small amount of cases where these decisions are being made like comparative to bigger issues. And I think you can't have it both ways. Either we are all up in parents' business about how they're parenting their children, the medical decisions they're making, the choices they're making for their children. And I don't think more people want that generally. I don't think a lot of people want more government in their home with their children. I don't think that's a popular opinion. So this, I just don't understand how there is like a good faith argument for this law. Like, I really don't.
And Chelsey, you bring up another point is, going back to who's actually requesting this rule is conservatives. And they're the ones who generally want less government. Right? The idea is less government, less intrusion, more parental rights, more choices for schooling, more choices to what type of schooling, what books there are, what educational programs are offered, what literature is offered in their schooling. So if we're going to give parents back these rights for controlling what their children do, what they have, the care that they have, whether in school, out of school, then it seems to be disingenuous of, well, we want parents to have rights. We don't want the state to be controlling, but we do want to control them for having the
choices we disagree with.
Right, the 10 commandments on the walls. We do want to control them for making sure that they can't give gender-affirming care to their children. We want to control them for what seem to be Christian views, Christian ideas, and I'm not saying those are bad. I'm not saying I disagree with them, but the idea of our constitutional base of the separation of church and state is how much do we want big government is saying you can or you can't do this? And if you are, what are they supposed to say? So I know that's going to get us into our Louisiana 10 Commandments case for another episode.
Let me raise one other issue along with this. Wisconsin versus Yoder was a decision that involved whether Amish could, and I think it was 10th grade, whether they could take children out of school at 10th grade and then sort of put them in vocational training on their own. And the court majority sided with the rights of the Mennonites Amish to do this. But Justice Douglas had a very fascinating dissenting opinion. And his dissenting opinion said, we ought to be asking the kids what they want.
Yes.
And so we're sort of assuming here that the interest of the child and the parent align. But I can very well see, in fact, I think if one of my daughters had come to me and told me they thought they were a boy, I think I would tell them, well, if you think that, wait till you're 18 or 21 or later.
And let's get this in is I am your daughter. I'm one of your two daughters. So surprise for people who don't know. And even then you even had said you can't get your ears pierced until you're out of my house. And
I did.
And as much as I hated it when I was growing up, I thought that would be the first thing I do when I turn 18 and get out of this house. But I waited until I was 24.
Oh, you've done it? Oh, my goodness.
Really? Virginia, I didn't know this.
Now you tell me. Next thing I know, you're going to have a tattoo.
I have one of those too.
Don't tell me. I don't want to know.
How did I never know this? This is lore. This is deep lore right here.
It is some background. But you had the right as a parent, and as much as I hated it, it was like, oh, okay. And if I had done the same, can I have a tattoo? You'd have been like, heck no. When you leave the house, you can do whatever you want. But that was your right. And
I also think, similar to that, like we let parents decide whether or not to circumcise their infants, right? Yes. Like, are we going to decide that? That's getting the closest, right? We're talking about sort of
the sexual basis. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then what about plastic surgery?
Oh, okay. I would make the argument. I would make the argument that a 16-year-old girl getting a boob job is gender-affirming care. I would make that argument.
Oh, that's
Tell me how it's different, right?
Oh, fascinating. Yeah,
Because
and I don't know enough
But you
about
think
the
most of their
laws.
parents would agree with that?
Well, no.
Not with that
Most
idea.
parents
I think if
would
you ask
say-
them, but I think if you ask them, like 16-year-old girls, why are you getting this? It makes them feel more feminine, right? I mean, is that not at its basis like gender-affirming care?
Right. And even outside of that, 16-year-olds who are given, nose jobs and stuff, is that allowed if the doctor agrees to it, if the parent agrees to it, if the child wants it, if there's, enough consultation where they all decide that that's in the best interest, even if it's outside of insurance, then that's allowed.
Braces or veneers, or we let this happen. I don't really understand how this is different than any of the other medical decisions that we let parents make.
And it's
it's a highly emotional issue.
Yes. Oh, and extremely so.
And one way of gauging that is, am I right? As soon as the first trans individual was elected to Congress, they enacted a rule that is it she now, I believe.
Yes, correct.
That she cannot, that she must use the male or must use the bathroom that comported with her birth gender,
which is awful.
Yes,
awful to me.
Well, it clearly, I mean, it's singling out someone who I don't know.
I mean, you can just. Let her use the bathroom that she's identified with. And if not, you know what? There should be the family bathrooms, right? How many bathrooms do we have that are non-gender specific? That at least put them there, but we're going to die on a hill of discriminating against someone where you can make a bathroom or allow them to use a bathroom. It's not like our women's restrooms have urinals. It's not like we all have stalls, everybody. Yeah. It's not like people are using the restroom in public or without privacy.
This blows my mind. I'm sorry. This stuff really blows my mind. Like, everybody has a bathroom in their house. Well, that's a gender neutral bathroom. Like,
True.
I mean, like, be so for real. I mean, and when I've traveled abroad, and for a while I was taking classes, I was in Spain, and the college that everybody was staying at had on like the main floor bathrooms that were co-ed is not the word I'm looking for.
Unisex?
There we go. Yeah. I can think of the word. Yeah. And it was not a big deal. Like, I think this is so strange. This is like a weird obsession with like a micro topic, and I do not get why our legislators are so focused on it. It seems weird to me.
It seems personally attacking. Yes. And that's how it feels with conservatives right now. And not that, again, I'm in such a weird personal political, path of my own here, but it feels very specific. It feels very targeted.
So let me throw out one at the risk of personal hate mail. The transgender issue in athletics, I think is more complicated. I haven't come to a firm decision on it, except that I do think there are certain advantages that come with being born, maleness, being born male. And I'm not sure that they are always compensated for by the time someone who's transitioning to female joins a team. And I know some teammates have expressed concerns over this person is so much bigger and stronger. We don't even feel safe on our own team.
Right.
I think that's an issue. I think is a more problematic. I think it's more difficult. There you can phrase that in terms of a women's rights issue. That it's not fair to a woman who, has been learning to swim for, 20 years of her life, and suddenly she's competing against someone who was born male and still might have the extra muscles or skeletal structure or something that the male would have. So I think there are some, and I can see why, there's been some female athletes who have been, very vocal in believing that this was unfair to them. And, we do need to remember we need to remember women's rights here as well as the trans rights.
Oh, absolutely. So going back, I have to tell a little personal story while we're talking about Dad and what we could and couldn't do. Then we can move on, but I have to end on it. So my parents, Dr. Vile and my mom, Linda, they also, of course, were against tattoos and still are, which is fair. And I get it. But it took until I was, I don't know, in my 30s to actually get a tattoo. And it's somewhere that you can't see. I'm an attorney. I don't want to walk into court. A lot of people disagree, but I don't want to walk into a court with tattoos showing. So it was somewhere more discreet. And I didn't tell Mom and Dad. I didn't tell them at all. I was getting married in my 30s. And we were at the wedding, and all of my bridesmaids are gone. All of my female friends are gone. There's nobody left to help me get out of my dress. And I could not get out of my wedding dress without help. And my mom was so sweet. She was like, but I can help you. I was like, well, of course you can. And I just kept looking for anyone else, because if she helped me, she was going to see my tattoo, and I hadn't told her I had a tattoo. So I didn't know, I was panicking. I was like, what do I do? I don't want her to be devastated on the day of my wedding. This is supposed to be happy. I know she's going to be disappointed and upset. And so finally, it was just her, and I couldn't withhold it because she really wanted to help, and I didn't have any other good reason why she couldn't help. So I hung my head and I was like, Mom, I got to tell you something. She's like, what's that? I was like, I have a couple tattoos. And she paused so long. And she said, well, what are they? And I told her. And one's actually a Bible verse, a full Bible verse written in italics or script, whatever you want to say. Most people can't read it anymore. And she was so cute. She was helping. And the only other thing that she said was, well, can I read it? I was like, yes, Mom, so you can read it. And she said that she really loved the verse, and she was glad that I had chosen that verse, and we've never spoken of it again.
And I don't think she told me either.
That's so funny to me.
So there's my story about parental rights and tattoos, and surprise, Dad, in case you didn't know.
That is so funny. See, okay, my mom just said, she was like, when you're 18, you can do whatever you want. When you're 18, you can do whatever you want. And I wanted, and I remember having this discussion. I was a cheerleader in high school, and I wanted a belly button piercing so badly. I wanted one so badly. And she was like, well, I would love for you to do that when you're 18. So not as strict. So then I'm like a fully adult woman, because I didn't do it till like my late 20s. But I was like, you know what I'm going to do? Go get my belly button pierced. It's not popular anymore. It's no longer the early 2000s. Like, this is no longer the look.
But you chose, and it was after, your parents said after 18. So
yeah.
There are things, and there are decisions we make that we live with, for good or for ill, before and after our parents, when we're out of their house.
I'm glad I wasn't allowed to get tattoos as like a 15-year-old. Can you imagine what you could have on your body if you got to pick out your tattoos at 15? Tragic.
It's scary enough when we're 18 and above, and I had a long 30-something years to think about mine. So. And even I am like, well, it could have been a little lower. Or, there's always the questions, but you make decisions. And a lot of this for the gender-affirming care is very personal, very deep emotionally. And the
identity.
The question for identity is, how much harm would a state do by inserting themselves into identity and into a family relationship? And a lot of the question is, well, they're going to change their minds later, et cetera, et cetera. And so maybe that's the better part for the age issue but do we still offer some kind of care? Maybe it's the hormone care without surgery that can still support these individuals who are having identity questions and identity decisions at an earlier age where they know. And who are we to say that they don't? So it's the emotional question later is, I could say, yeah, we don't want a tattoo on myself as a 13-year-old versus later. But how do we support the individuals overall even from the very beginning. And if we don't allow them, it just seems much more of an age issue than anything. And I hope people don't discriminate based on sex, because I think that would be a failure.
Could it also be, isn't it basically an epistemological issue?
In what way?
What do we really know? And when did we know it? Yes. I mean, and this goes back to that question about what are they doing in Europe?
Yeah.
It appears that at least in some European nations, they experimented and they concluded that as many people were harmed as were helped. And, it's possible that 10 years from now, we'll come back and everybody will say, well, Tennessee was absolutely right. This didn't work. But that's not the way I currently weigh the evidence. I mean, I think the evidence, but I do think neither side should be absolutely sure that the evidence is pointing in their direction, because I think there is, there are kids who have said, if I couldn't have this surgery, I would have killed myself.
Exactly.
And occasionally there is someone who will say, I got the surgery and I'm sorry that I did.
Yes.
And, again, epistemology, what do we know and who knows it? The doctors and the parents or the state legislators?
Chelsey, you're mentioning suicide rates.
I was going to say that was brought up a little bit. I said the oral arguments, they kind of got off.
Sotomayor, or Kagan, either Kagan or Sotomayor brought up the evidence she pointed to was that people with sexual dysphoria tend to be more likely to commit suicide.
Especially as children, as teenagers, usually those rates are astronomical compared. But I do think sort of the evidence on what best practices are when it comes to this. I mean, I think we're very early in understanding that in a scientific way. But I think a similar conversation, Virginia and I have had this personal conversation. I knew from a very young age I did not want children ever. I'm 6 months away from being 30, and I feel the way I feel about it. I felt that at 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. I would not have been able to make the choice to sterilize myself at 15 or 16 years old, because people are scared that, you'll go on to regret it. And I think I think there are some things we just know identity-wise that you can know that young. Does that mean that we should at 15? I had that experience. I would not have regretted it if I had made that choice at 15. And this 15 years later.
But some people would have.
But some people would have. Yeah. And so I don't know how we I don't want to make that choice for anybody else. I don't think a state government should be making that choice for anybody else.
Because if you're not a parent, you won't have to.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, absolutely not.
For sure.
And when it comes to people being involved, see, this is always the argument I make. If we're going to let the government be involved in people's parenting decisions, I don't think these parents in Tennessee want somebody like me, say, getting elected and then getting to choose how they parent their children.
We're not going to elect you, I can tell you.
I could never get elected. Oh my God, no. But I'm saying it could switch. I don't think they consider that, okay, sure, maybe right now people agree with me. Well, what if there are people who are elected that don't?
Yeah. I think the ultimate issue is state control, is how much do we want the government involved in very personal decisions. All right. So that's our take. We always do a Supreme Court review in the summers when all of these decisions come down, so you can guarantee that we will be back with the full decision and our take on what that decision is. But you've got the hot take as far as what the arguments are and what should or shouldn't be considered and how constitutionally they are. So,
may I raise one other issue real quickly?
Let's do that.
You can cut it off if you want to.
Oh, no, of course not.
One of the advantages of going to church is we saw this last week. Yes?
Yes.
This week, actually.
We did this last
2 days
weekend.
ago, President-elect Trump went to Notre Dame Cathedral.
Amazing. I so am jealous.
Pardon?
I'm so jealous. I would have loved to be there.
Absolutely. But sitting next to him was Joe Biden, and he took a picture, and he is now advertising a cologne and a perfume, which is called Fight, 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 and which is supposed to make even your enemies get
like
near you.
Right? Yeah.
And
I'll just put it next to my collectible Trump Bible. Obviously.
I think it's $199, but I believe there's like a half
heavens.
price special for the inauguration here. So if you want to smell good and bring about reconciliation, perhaps, if they just had this in the courtroom and could have sprinkled it on both sides, the arguments might have been much less intense than they were.
I think our followers should donate a bottle and we can all do a smell test and we can do a review. We can do a perfume review. Unbox.
This, by the way, by a candidate who is very concerned about possible conflicts of interest in government. Special interest. Anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if that added to the...
No, that's hilarious. And I'm glad you mentioned it. It definitely is these collectibles, coins, Bibles, cologne, scents.
I really think that's the Bible I should buy. I think that is calling to me, and I think that's what I should get.
I have a hard time. I will say I have a hard time buying Bibles at all. Because I think it's sad to commercialize that. I really support the Gideons in that, but that's just my never mind on that. But yeah, so I think this
By the way,
yes.
If someone wants a good book, this is right. It's not the Bible. I'm trying to get
the title looks like the Bible, but go ahead.
It's not.
Global History. Okay.
It's a global history by a Yale professor, Bruce Gordon. Now, there's a similar book on the Bible in America, which is also very good. But he has every translation of the Bible just about throughout world history.
Amazing.
And, very scholarly. And for those who like pictures, which I do, there are just beautiful pictures
oh my goodness.
on the side of some of these early Bibles, everything from Gutenberg.
Wow.
You name it, China, India, wherever Bibles have been translated. He has it, and I would highly recommend. It's about a little over 400 pages, but it's well worth it.
And you also have another book you've been reading. Speaking of biblical issues,
I do. This is for those who are particularly fascinated, as I am, by the support that Donald Trump has gotten among evangelicals, and it's called "The Violent Take It by Force," a Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. It's obviously from someone who's anti-Trump, but what's interesting about it, people have observed in the last several elections, evangelical Christians, often called Bible-believing Christians or born-again Christians, have tended to support Republican candidates, but they haven't supported any as strongly as they have Donald Trump.
Right.
And to many of us, sort of from inside that movement, and many of the leaders of the movement can't quite understand it because Trump's personal life,
we go back to the moral question,
discordant with, the kind of morality that evangelicals espouse. And this book makes the argument, and it's by, let's get the author, Matthew Taylor, who's actually a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary, which is one of the seminaries in the evangelical movement. He's now, PhD in religious studies from Georgetown, and he currently serves as senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. He argues that a lot of the initial evangelical support didn't come from the typical leaders. It came primarily from Paula White, you're probably familiar with, was a televangelist, which is also a little unusual among evangelicals. They tend to be fairly patriarchal, but it's a woman evangelical, and she introduced him to many of the other charismatic leaders throughout the country. And unlike, your traditional evangelicals, they rely Bible, sola scriptura, straight out of Martin Luther. But the charismatic Christians tend to put greater emphasis on continuing revelation. So they believe in modern apostles and they believe in modern prophets. And Paula White brings these people in and they begin prophesying that Donald Trump is the new Cyrus. He may be pagan, that's their words. He may be a pagan, but he's our pagan and he's going to stand up for our rights. And just like Cyrus brought the Israelites back from Babylon to Israel, he's going to protect evangelical rights. And it's really a fascinating book. I've had to revise some of my own books that I'm working on right now to sort of, put this in as part of the equation as to what's happening.
Well, certainly one I'm actually considering buying. So thank you for those.
It's a very good read, and what's fascinating is also he distinguishes between your denominational and your non-denominational, and your charismatic and non-charismatic, and it comes up with some very good insights, I think.
All right, Chelsey, what's your statement here?
Okay, no, I've been thinking about this. Dr. Vile, you know what I really think you should do? I'm not trying to give you a homework assignment, but I'm saying.
Homework, that's just what I need.
Give him one.
I love it. Vacation's coming up. I need something to give meaning to my life. Yes.
I think it would be so cool if you put together, because you have such an expertise, you've read so many books, top 10 books, you want to get into this topic about American history. Here are my recommendations of the 10 most impact, you do 10, 20, I would personally, I have been keeping a list of every book you mentioned on the podcast. Okay. So I personally, it'd be helpful if they'd be grouped because it's just kind of random at this point. I just write down every book you mentioned.
Okay, well, I got to mention, you then I'm going to give you one more, okay?
Oh, perfect.
This is one,
nice.
I have never been a fan. I should be because I'm from Virginia. But this is a book on Woodrow Wilson by Christopher Cox, and it's called The Light Withdrawn.
Okay.
And it basically, I'd say that it's a hack job, except it's very well documented. For example, I have always told people that the only president in U.S. history with a PhD was Woodrow Wilson.
I didn't know that.
So here's what I find out. Wilson started at Davidson College, withdrew after a year or two, went to Princeton where he was a mediocre student, went to Johns Hopkins University seeking a PhD, but dropped out after a year and a half. Well, no, wait, before that, no, he graduates from Princeton. He goes to University of Virginia, where after a year, he goes back to Atlanta and sets up a law practice without ever getting the degree. Then he goes to Johns Hopkins, withdraws without getting a degree. He gets a job at Bryn Mawr.
Chelsea's very confused.
Okay. He goes to Bryn Mawr, where he has to teach all women, and he hates it because he doesn't think women are capable of the kind of thought that he can give. So but while he's there, while he was at Johns Hopkins for a year and a half, he published a book called Congressional Government. Now, you know the distance between Baltimore and D.C.
Yes. I do.
Wilson never visited Congress, although he wrote this definitive book on Congress by committees, okay?
Are you telling me he's just a scam artist? Is this what I'm hearing?
Okay,
yes!
So subsequently, yes. Wilson writes, one of his friends encourages him to write and asks them to give him a PhD. Because he's published this book. He didn't go through orals. He didn't go through writtens. He didn't write a dissertation, but he published a book. And he persuaded them to give him a PhD. And in the meantime, another friend, Thomas Dixon, author of The Klansman, which was a book that led to the birth of a nation, he convinces Wake Forest University to give him a law degree, an LLM. So Wilson 5 or 10 books that he writes, all of them have Woodrow Wilson, PhD, LLM.
Honestly,
and of course, Wilson, and again, I
Chelsey,
do think
you and I have some writing to do for requests for PhDs.
Okay, this is Christopher Cox writes this. He is a senior scholar at the University of California at Irvine. I think there are times where he probably doesn't give Wilson the credit that he's due. But I will say that, it wasn't long ago, if I remember correctly, that Princeton University renamed their department of, it's no longer the Woodrow Wilson Department of Government and Foreign Affairs, because what he did when he was president is he reintroduced racial segregation.
Yeah.
And although he is given credit for eventually supporting the 19th Amendment, this came very, very late. And he was for force feeding and also, during the Wilson administration was the first Red Scare.
Right.
Where Attorney General Palmer, and this comes back to the appointments issue in our last issue, which is if you have an attorney general who is so beholden to the president that he's willing to round up anybody that could be considered an enemy of the United States on the president's word, you probably want more independence than that. So it's very thought-provoking. I don't think it's not, I do think that he underrates some of Wilson's achievements. But it's a very eye-opening book.
See, Pardon? I said I have mixed feelings about that because, okay, here's the thing. I don't want people to be scam artists, but if you can convince that many people, I kind of have to give it to you. Like at some point, do you not just say, I mean, you earned it, but that gives me an idea, Virginia. See, because I could never go to medical school because don't do blood, don't do needles, but I might be able to convince someone
to give you an honorary MD.
Yes, and
wait, I don't want you operating on me.
No. It's just so I can have JDMD at the end. Well, I really want all four.
I want the PhD. That's what I want, but I don't want to have to write the thesis. If I could just submit some of my motions and briefs and say I've written more than enough theses.
Yeah, I would rather. I don't want to write it. Can I just talk to somebody for 3 hours?
Ghostwriting.
Get AI to do it for you.
It's totally ghostwriting.
No, okay. I just would prefer. Let me recite to you 27 pages of writing, but I'll just say it. I'll just talk about it. I think that's so much more fun.
I think what I'm going to do
is... get by with a 27-page dissertation, let me know. Okay. Didn't work for me.
Fair enough.
I'm going to co-author with Dr. Vile, I think is what my next plan is.
That's a shoo-in right there.
Right?
You're being a Nepo baby, Virginia. Come on.
If Biden can pardon his son, then Dr. Vile can choose me to represent us and him with the book.
You just need to ghostwrite him forever. For the rest of eternity, you'll just write as Dr. John Vile. He'll just live on in perpetuum. I love that.
Absolutely. He doesn't even have to put it in his will.
Okay.
We've digressed by now.
Yes, oh my goodness.
All right. Well, Dr. Vile can be confident that his legacy will continue.
We're waiting for his book list, his recommended reading.
Yes, we'll get the book list. And in the meantime, you can check out the 8 core subjects of law at thelawanscripted.com to catch up on criminal law, constitutional law, civil law, etc. So check that out and check out Tehrani Law LLC, where Chelsey and I are running our business from Maryland. We'll have some updates on that in the new year. So very excited. Continue to think of us through the Christmas holidays. We will get through at least the next couple of weeks, and then we'll probably pause during Christmas and New Year's weeks, and then we'll be back with a new season. But stay tuned. Definitely, we will hit the 10 Commandment court case in Louisiana and probably a couple more. We might end up doing the Penny case from New York.
Texas has a Bible.
Yes, and Texas will join the Louisiana and Texas cases on one of our next episodes. But do stay tuned with us as we hit the hottest legal topics on the Legal Weekly Wine.